times have you prefaced a comment with, "I'm sorry," or took ownership of something that wasn't your fault, or even spoke faster than usual to avoid taking up too much time? These communication patterns have been molded for us both in and outside of the workplace, and they don't allow us to grow to our full potential. With us today is Julia Prince, Communications Advisor with CRA Admired Leadership, to discuss how we communicate and how it can help or hinder our success. Julia advises and supports clients in using strategic communication within their organizations to improve organizational effectiveness, manage key relationships, and achieve business goals, specifically during times of change. Her recent clients include Stanley Black & Decker, Dell Technologies, KPMG, and Freddie Mac. Without further delay, I'm pleased to welcome Julia Prince.
Hi, everyone. And thank you, Michelle, for that introduction. Good to see you. Before we get started, I would love to hear where everybody is from. So thinking we can get the chat going. So in the comments, please let me know where you're tuning in from and also what industry you're in. So I am joining everyone today from my home in South Philadelphia. And this is my home office. But again, happy to be here. So hopefully as those chats begin to roll in, let's get started. For the past several months, I've been helping with an acquisition of a global manufacturing company. And as part of that, I've been tuning into quarterly earning calls. And I typically don't listen to them live, but I'll listen to them when I get ready in the morning. And a few weeks ago, I was listening to an earnings call for this acquisition, and I hear from the CEO. He gives an overview, the VP of Investor Relations, and I'm mid mascara swipe when we get to the Q&A portion. And I hear an analyst say, "I'm sorry, if I can just take a second of your time. I know there are a lot of people with questions on this call, but," and then they ask the question. And we've seen this in headlines, and it's been covered from The View to Elle to BBC, that women's words matter, and particularly the "I'm sorries" and the "justs." And this has raised a few questions. Are women undermining themselves with these communication practices, or are these strategic acts or behaviors to help them feel or be more heard? Or is this just another criticism on women in the workplace? And truth is, while women may use these kind of phrases more frequently, men do the same thing. And people everywhere communicate in ways that don't always properly serve them. In fact, the person I was referring to earlier on the call, he was a man on the earnings call who made that comment. But today I'll highlight some of the communication patterns that have been modeled for us, both in and outside of the workplace, that are detrimental to not just women, but any of us. And my goal is for you to walk away with tactics, actual strategies, and behaviors that you can begin to adopt in your own life that are going to help you get to where you want to go. Now, you're here because communication matters to you. And your goal may not to be the most eloquent person on an earnings call. Maybe it's to be better heard, or maybe it's to be more credible in front of your peers, to sound more confident in front of your boss. Maybe you want to be visible to higher ups in your organization. Or maybe you want to get your point across in a better way at your PTA meeting on Friday. But no matter what your goal is, and no matter where you want to go, communication is key to really helping you get there. So Chris is going to share some slides with us that hopefully prompt this chat. I want to take a second to talk about communication and what that actually means. So in the chat, if you've joined us already, I would love to see what words come to mind when I say the word communication. What words do you associate with this phrase? So again, what words come to mind for you when you hear the word communication? As people are responding, I'll say that most organizations have communication functions. And so every company has a slightly different interpretation of what that function does. And one of the most common challenges I hear with comms people is people don't know what we do. So I'll take a second to pause again. What words come to mind when I say the word communication? We're saying connection, exchange of ideas, engagement, talking, support, delivering a message, effective, expressing ideas, understanding, clear and concise. Yes, that is often the goal. Relationships, explaining. These are great words. I think that come to mind for many of us. But oftentimes communication is also associated with journalism or writing. And if you work with a corporate communication function, you know this through and through, that communication is not just what we say, but it's this element of something beyond that. So it's not just the tangible things. It's not the emails or the newsletters or the town hall meetings. It's everything also that's in between. Communication, in essence, is what we do. And so when I coach business leaders, there are two things that always sit in the back of my mind. So I'll just to display one of those things, I'll have us go to this next slide here. So let's imagine if you join a call and this is the only thing that you see on the screen. The screen is just black like this. And you sit and you wait. And you don't hear anybody say anything. And there are no images that appear. And you might wait for a while. You might begin to think there's a technical error on the call, or our presenter isn't here yet, or even our presenter has forgotten what they were going to say. The message here is that we cannot not communicate. So everything that we say or do and everything that we don't say or don't do sends a message. So as just a culture of people, we love and rely on nonverbal cues. This idea that we cannot not communicate. So imagine if we're walking down the aisle of a grocery store and we see someone and they're tapping their chin like this and looking around. It's pretty obvious to us what they're doing. They're looking for something, or they're trying to remember an item that's on their list. And it's pretty evident. Or my favorite is when you get on an airplane, if some of you have done that these days, and the person next to you immediately puts in their AirPods. That's the universal sign for do not talk to me. Even when we're not saying something, we're always sending a message. This is something that we need to constantly keep in mind. The next point is an important one too, that communication is inherently strategic. And so what do I mean by that? We are constantly communicating, whether we know it or not, on three separate planes. And those planes are task, identity, and relationship. Task refers to what we need to do, the actual task of getting things done. It's referring to information itself. So that would include what you need, when, where, how, or why. Children are especially great at task-based communication or thinking this way. So if you're a child, or if you have children at home, if you maybe have some candy laying on the counter, your son or daughter is going to do everything in their power to maybe get that candy. They let you know, or they go and they get it. It's all about the task, getting to where they want to go. They rarely consider these other two elements, the first being identity, which refers to our brand. And this is all about how we want to be seen. So again, whether we're communicating this openly or thinking about it or not, we are always sending a message on this front. So brand refers to our values, our character, our nature, our likes and our dislikes. Most people, I would say, adult people in the workforce or in our everyday lives, think about the task, what they're trying to get done, but also their identity. They're thinking about what they want to do and how they want to be seen. Rarely do people think about all these three things at the same time. And we know that the most strategic people are considering this last part, which is also relationships. And this refers to the us. So not only are they thinking about what do I want to do or how do I want to be seen, strategic people are also thinking about what type of relationship do I want to build with the person I'm connecting with. So this refers to and takes into account the boundaries, norms, levels of respect. It refers to influence and trust. So when you are maybe meeting someone new, or you're going into an engagement with work, whatever the case, whatever the scenario is, it's so important to not only think about what you're trying to do, your objective, or how you want to be seen, also consider the kind of relationship that you want to build. So for example, let's say that I'm sitting at the dinner table with my fiance. I'm getting married in May, and I'm excited about it. But if I really want him to pass me the salt, and if I'm only focused on task, I might just say, "Hey, give me the salt." Not the best way to maybe communicate with him. It's going to have some sort of ramification. But if I really want the salt, that's probably the fastest and best way to get it now. If I'm considering my identity or my brand or how I want to be seen, I'm going to phrase that question a little bit differently. I might say something like, "Hey, honey, can you please pass me the salt?" A step beyond that is considering the relationship. So not just how do I want to be seen, but how do I want to build a stronger relationship with him? So I might say, "Hey, honey, can you please pass me the salt? How was your day today?" And engage in a conversation and consider maybe the context of how his day was, or maybe he had something big that day that I might ask about too. So thinking about these 3 planes is always going to set us up for greater success, even just by thinking about it. And before we go into any conversation, to consider that relationship piece as well. And this sounds really maybe clinical now, but when you begin to think this way, it becomes natural, and it's not something you're thinking about maybe at the forefront of your brain. But let's get into some of these strategies and tactics. So with this baseline understanding of communication, I want to really get some feedback first from this group, hopefully. And I want to know what's holding you back. So when you think about your communication with people that are near and dear to you, maybe they're people at work, maybe they're with members of your family or in your community, what are the things that are keeping you from getting where you want to go, or keeping you from establishing a stronger relationship with them? So I'll give it a second in the chat. We'd love to see some comments on this question. What's holding you back from a communication perspective? I'm going to say the question one more time too. What's holding us back from a communication perspective? The virtual world does impact how we read each other. Falling into the family dance. I'm interested in that one. I wonder if that's about maybe you're rooted in your ways of how you communicate with your family, or there are certain norms maybe that you do when you're with them. Fear of rejection, that's a real one. A lack of confidence, too focused on tasks and not relationships, overthinking, time to plan. That's huge. This overthinking, that can be a detriment to a lot of us. And sometimes we try really hard to script ourselves before we go into conversations. Maybe it's a meeting with your boss and you say, I want to make sure I touch on these things. And you write yourself an actual script and you go in and you've memorized it. It begins to sound too prepared and manicured, and it doesn't sound like you. Not really knowing the person. That's challenging. I think we can talk a little bit about this, about how we approach people who we don't know all the context around, and how we can engage with them in maybe safe ways to get to know them better, but also to make sure we don't go into awkward situations or have some weird boundary issues. Fear of failure, that's real, and rejection. How to object correctly. Yeah, how to disagree agreeably with someone. That's a really important skill. How can we object to maybe what they're saying in a way that's still relational and important? All of these are great. And I'd love to get more thoughts and participation from the group as I go through some of these strategies and tactics that hopefully address some of these things. Let's talk about confidence a little bit. And I've seen some of these things in here about rejection and fear of failure. So what are things that we can actually do to build confidence? I have 4 things here that I want to focus on. These are things that we can amplify or really begin to practice. All of this is based on research. So I would say research and also just seeing it work really well with clients. So there's that anecdotal element too. But bottom line is that doing these things are going to help you improve in certain ways or help your perception as you begin to engage with whoever you're engaging with from a work standpoint, but also in your personal and family lives. So this first one about matching your language intensity to audience expectations. So let's think back to when we were children. As a child, you learn from the beginning that certain words carry certain degrees of intensity. So hate is going to be more intense than the word dislike, or excellent is going to be more intense than the word good. Language intensity refers to how much language is deviating from this neutral ground. So for example, hate is going to be further away from neutral than maybe dislike, or excellent is going to be further away from neutral than good. And research tells us that when language intensity matches the expectation of whoever you're talking to, the message acceptance will increase. So this means that your message will land better when you're matching the intensity of your words with what they are expecting to hear. So let's think about an example of this. Imagine you're at a high school football homecoming game, and behind the scenes, the coach meets with the team, and this is the pump up talk, like let's go get them. And imagine if that coach said in his speech to the player says, "Okay, guys, let's go out and really do well tonight." A message is not going to land as well as if that coach said, "Let's go pummel the team or fight or dominate," and using those more aggressive words with a higher intensity. And the reason why those words work in that situation is because that's what that team needs to hear. That's what's going to fuel them to do what the coach is hoping them to do. But if you flip that, imagine if we're in a business setting, and maybe this is with a hospital system. If we're using words like dominate, fight, crush the competition, it's not always going to land well with people. Maybe it's softer, more benevolent language that's going to work, where that intensity is closer to neutral than maybe some of those other words. So in terms of making this actionable for you, think first before you communicate, think first about the intensity of your language and ask yourself, does this match the situation and expectations of my audience? And again, this applies in a work setting or in your personal life as well. This next factor is about building a richer lexical diversity. That's a mouthful of a word, but in layman's terms, this means having a big vocabulary. So lexical diversity is the opposite of redundancy. So someone who repeats the same words over and over again, they have a low lexical diversity. But research suggests that people who have rich lexical diversity are seen as more competent. They're seen as having a higher or being of a higher social status. They're more persuasive than others. And in fact, having or being of a higher social status, lexical diversity additionally and further enhances their message's influence. So if you're already of a high social status or appearing that way and you use a larger vocabulary, your message is going to have more influence. It's just what research suggests. It's fascinating. But research also is saying that lexical diversity is really persuasive in written messages and in formal situations. So imagine if you are writing a letter to your homeowners association and you're trying to press for something about the way the lawns are cut. According to research, if you use a broader vocabulary throughout that letter, the message itself is going to seem more credible and more persuasive. So the takeaway is broaden your vocabulary or work to broaden your vocabulary with the hope of becoming more persuasive, which in turn I think makes you a little bit more confident. Next, let's talk about vivid detail. The best stories that we've ever heard, let's think back to stories that we think are really, really fantastic. Maybe they're fairy tales from when we were children or really good books that we've read now. The authors are able to describe situations or people so vividly that you can imagine them in your own mind. So vivid detail refers to that extent that information provokes this image in your head, or the extent in which information is emotionally interesting or is seen as personally relevant. Research also tells us that vivid information is more persuasive than dry information. And that's because for a message or for a statement to be persuasive, the receiver of that message needs to be able to comprehend it and then also remember it. So in speaking with vivid detail or writing with vivid detail, it forces that person receiving the message to read and consider it and spend more time in thought. And the way that I like to give an example of this is think about compliments. And if your goal is to seem more sincere, your compliments really need to have an element of vivid detail. So if I say to someone I know, maybe it's my father-in-law, I might say, Mike, you look really great in that suit. That compliment, I think, would land well with him. But imagine if I gave that same compliment and I said, Mike, the vertical stripes on your suit, they make you really appear long and lean, and that extra room in your shoulders gives the suit jacket a more athletic look. I think it looks great. That message is going to land it will land better with him because he'll remember it a little bit more. He'll think about the comments and it will make me appear more sincere. And so the name of the game, though, is not to trick people into perceiving you as a sincere person. But if you are striving to really come across a certain way, vivid detail is going to help you appear more sincere about what you're saying, and your message is going to be more persuasive. And lastly, let's talk about strong qualifiers. When I use the word qualifier, this is meaning the words that go in front of phrases that emphasize certainty of something. So these are words like certainly, or surely. We put those words in front of our statements to strengthen whatever we're saying. And research suggests this is the right move. When you use strong qualifiers, you're appearing more confident and credible. But the thing is, you have to be careful here because it can backfire. So imagine if you're at a party and you start every one of your sentences with obviously, and you don't have the backing to support what you're saying. If you aren't able to prove what you're saying, you're not going to be seen as persuasive or credible. You're actually going to be seen as maybe disconnected or out of touch, or just someone who's unreliable. So other strong qualifiers can include words like all, or exactly, or absolutely, or 100%. So the coaching point around this is when you're in situations where you have to, when you're sure of something, or you're really working to make a point, pepper in those strong qualifiers that you believe this 100%, or certainly this is because of this. That is going to show confidence in what you're sharing. And it's also going to make your message more persuasive. People are going to believe you more. So I'm going to take a pause here. Again, these are 4 things that you can begin to do now that are going to help get you where you go from a communication perspective. I do want to switch over and talk about, so what are the things we don't want to do? Things that we want to stop doing or eliminate and avoid. And these aren't necessarily particularly novel, but they're hard to crack. And as someone who speaks frequently, these are things that I still am not perfect on. And I don't think anybody is. But if we're actively thinking about these items, we can begin to get a little bit better at getting our messages across and communicating in the most effective way to reach whatever goal we're trying to reach. So let's talk about non-words. Let's start there. So non-words refer to those words or those non-words that we use to fill the space. These are words like or okay, like is a really common one. But what these do is this creates pause. It breaks up what our sentences and shows, and especially if we do this a lot, it shows that there is a lack of confidence or precision in what we're saying. Hedges are another one. Hedges are the phrases that we put in front of our statements to allow for exceptions or allow us or help us avoid strong commitments to what we're saying. So hedges can include words like I think, or maybe, I hope so, sort of. When we use those words and we don't take them out, we are expressing in ourselves this lack of confidence in what we're even saying. Let's talk about empty adjectives. This is another example. Empty adjectives are words, we use these all the time, but they distract instead of enhance what we're trying to say. My favorite example of this is interesting. If you've ever been telling someone a story and they come back and they say, interesting, we have no idea what that means. And most of the time, the person saying that, a lot of times they're not even listening. They're just trying to fill the space because maybe they weren't really paying attention. But using words like good or cute or interesting, they're really not saying much. We have to find ways to replace those words with something that actually fits the need of what the conversation is. Another one is tag questions. As women, this is something research tells us that we do more frequently than men. We change phrases into questions that don't need to be questions. And this is, so let's give an example of this. This might be saying something like, this is the right page, right? Or this is where we're supposed to be, isn't it? Or let's start the meeting, okay? When we say things in forms of questions, we are expressing that we're not quite sure, or we don't know, or we need the validation of somebody else to make sure what we're doing is right. And then lastly in here, overly polite forms or especially formal grammar. This is when someone sounds like a book or isn't relatable. So I like to draw the comparison between a high school valedictorian speech versus someone giving a TED Talk. So when we think about high school valedictorians and who they are and what they want to do, they want to come across as smart and credible. And so oftentimes they make their speeches sound like that. They're ultra formal. They might show up really buttoned up and try to sound really important. But what that does is it distances them from their audience, and their peers in the class are saying, well, that doesn't really sound like them, or that person is just posturing. When you look at TED Talks, or we listen to really good TED Talks, the people typically are not overly formal. They get up there, they show you who they are, they tell this story in a way that is personable and makes sense. And that message is more memorable. Oftentimes it lands better with you. So in terms of coaching points for yourself, in specific situations, try not to be overly polite. So this includes not apologizing for things that are out of your control. So no I'm sorries, or even tagging miss or misses onto people's names sometimes, and then not using overly formal grammar. That's going to help you out a lot, especially when you're trying to build credibility with people in your life. So maybe that's a boss, maybe that's your neighbor. Being overly formal is going to really set you back. What you actually need to do is strive to become more peer-like and act like a peer as much as possible. And what we know about peers, our peers are not overly formal with each other. They actually sound like friends. So when you go into a meeting with your boss, the question is not, how do I sound really smart in the situation? It's more about, how do I get my point across, or how do I communicate with them in an effective way that makes me sound more like a peer? So I see a question in the chat about this. It says, in relation to formal grammar, how to avoid it when it is embedded culturally. English does not use it as much, but professional Spanish does. It took me years to get it out of my normal daily professional communication. It's really interesting. I actually saw a video about this the other day. It was coaching points from people where English is their second language, about how to begin to take out some of those more formal phrases, just because it has been culturally embedded. I don't know that I have any specific research off the top of my head about doing this from a different culture standpoint, but I do know about how you can begin to practice some of these techniques. I think first is you have to be able to identify where you see it. So for example, maybe Spanish is your first language, maybe you're bilingual. Being able to identify that formal speak or that formal conjugation in Spanish, and then being able to see, okay, what is the equivalent maybe in English, or where am I seeing that formal speech in English? Being able to first identify it in other people is going to be the first thing to do. And then you're better able to identify it in yourself. And then next it comes practice. And this person gets to it here. It took me years to get it out of my normal daily professional communication. None of this is going to change immediately overnight. and that's okay. But it is going to take a degree of practice. But first, that step is to be able to identify it in other people, then identify it in yourself. Okay, I'm seeing another question here too about the lexical diversity or having a large vocabulary. Wouldn't it be pretentious if you use complex vocabulary to communicate? Isn't simplicity the name of the game for corporate communication? Absolutely. When we think about messages, and I help leaders craft messages all the time, we have to be careful of and really consider the audience. So there's a difference between maybe posturing and sounding overly studious or academic, and then versus using a larger array of words. Maybe it's more about variety of words than bigger vocabulary words. This is more about that variety than using large words, because we don't want to come across as pretentious. That's where this formal grammar and formal or overly polite forms come into play. When we begin to use those, that's going to be a detriment to ourselves. Any other questions about some of these markers? So we just chatted about things that we can do to enhance our confidence, but also some things that we need to eliminate or restrict in our vocabulary. What recommendations do we have for practicing better communication skills? I would say practice them with someone that you trust first, and typically outside of work settings. I do think practice can begin to weave into work settings, but the safest place to practice some of these things are at home. And there are a few things that you can do. So again, with this question about maybe Spanish or English second language, about how do you begin to take out more formal language, this idea of being able to first identify it in other people, identify maybe the things that you want to get better at, or maybe it's identifying those areas of opportunity. So every time you're at the grocery store, listen for non-words, see where you see them, and keep track of them in your head. That's the first step. And then begin to recognize, I just said, maybe 5 times in that presentation, or I said when I was talking to my daughter. That's going to help you begin to recognize them in yourself. The next step I would say would be potentially journaling about them. And no, I feel like no one has time to actually journal anymore. But what I mean about journaling is more about keeping track of this information. So maybe that is maybe you have a work tracker or a to-do list. Maybe you have a section of that to-do list that says, maybe it's my communication, and track down times where you were ineffective. So maybe it was a time that you were overly polite and you shouldn't have been. And instead of writing your feelings down about it, write down what you did and then what you want to do next time, what you're going to do next time to be better. And that's going to help you keep these things top of mind for yourself. I think we'll go to some more questions in a little bit, but I do want to run through this activity briefly. So let's blow this up here on the screen so people can see some of these questions. But this idea came from addiction recovery theory. When a smoker maybe is trying to change a habit, they are asked to replace their smoking or their cigarettes with something else. And that's going to help them fill the void. So there's been further research on this, and there's more detail. It's probably more complex, but the essence of this exercise is I want to take a look at maybe some of these problematic phrases and see how can we revise them. What are some new phrases that we can use instead of these here that are going to help us communicate more effectively? All of these phrases I heard on that earnings call that I had mentioned earlier on the phone. They are, can I ask a question? This will just take a second. And then the person speeds up as they talk. Does that make sense? This might be a silly idea, or sorry, just want to jump in and say, these are the phrases that we're hoping to avoid. Many of them are those hedges, or they're being over apologetic, framing things in forms of questions. But let's take a look at maybe the first one here. Instead of saying, can I ask a question before asking a question, what's a revised way that we might respond instead of using, can I ask a question? I'm going to give the chat a second to speed up. So again, for those who are still joining, so instead of saying, can I ask a question? What might be something that we can say instead that's going to get that point across? I love this answer. Just ask the question. Absolutely. We don't need to ask a question of whether or not we can ask a question. This is rarely appropriate. Simply say your question. Or if there's this time where you need to get into the conversation a little bit more, you might say, I'd like to ask a question, or I have a question. Those are perfect examples. Let's go to this next one. This will just take a second and then speed up. This is a really common thing that people do. There's this fear, and just hearing about the things that are holding you back, there's this fear too of taking up too much time or space. And this is mostly just a personal issue. It's rare that other people are actively thinking about this every single time we speak. I will say though that people do need to raise their self-awareness at times and know when they're speaking too long or when they're taking up too much time. But if you're going to jump in with with just an insightful thing to say, maybe it's in a meeting, maybe it's in a conversation with your family, it's rare that someone else is saying, oh, Julie's taking up too much space by just being present. So what can we say instead of, this will just take a second? So right here, just say what you want to say. I think that's a great example. This also goes in line with this, can I ask a question? There's an element of beginning to adopt some of these practices. There's a part of that we just need to adopt some of them. We just need to build up the guts sometimes to just say what we need to say. And that's going to take some practice. And it's going to involve some sort of failure or hardship along the way, which is okay. It's the only way we can get better. There's a comment in here. You have to remember that what you have to say is important also. This is true. This is something interesting about confidence. There are things that we can do to build our confidence, but there's this element too that this comes from within us and it takes some time to build. So even if this is just a reminder that what you have to say is important, then I think that's enough. So before we go into the maybe Q&A of this session, just again, a reminder that what you say matters. And even if you're not perfect at communicating, remember that none of us are. Everyone's trying to get better. But by adopting some of these behaviors and these strategies and tactics, it really is going to make a difference. Also, making sure that we're being really mindful that we are always communicating, whether we're saying something or not, we're always sending a message, and that communication is strategic. We're always thinking or communicating on those planes of task, identity, relationship. That's going to help you get better and get to where you need to go, wherever it is. So I'll pause here and let's see if we have any broader questions from the group. Okay. What do you say instead of, does this make sense? Now let's think about that. Oftentimes people have these after questions. Does this make sense when they're not confident in what they're saying, or the other person hasn't responded yet? Oftentimes in this scenario, people are still processing what you're saying. So to me, instead, I would take out the does this make sense? And I would just let my statement sit. I might let it sit for at least, depending on the situation, for a few seconds, and wait for the other person to come out and say, well, can you clarify? Or maybe they're just trying to come up with an answer. I would eliminate that in its entirety. Or I might even say, if they're truly confused, where can I clarify? Or I repeat the question in a new way. I do a lot of teaching or development with teams, and there's a lot of thinking involved, and there's that white space where people are trying to find their next steps in their mind. So I might re-articulate to help them understand the question better, but that's after I wait. Okay, here's a question here. In your opinion, what's the most common communication blunder and people make, and how can we avoid it? So maybe this is what I'll say. People put themselves in awkward situations all the time. And they do this unintentionally. I don't think anyone's trying to put themselves in awkward situation, but we're put in awkward situations. So let's imagine if you're joining a meeting and you see someone's face on the screen and you're not quite sure if you know them or not, you're not quite sure if you've seen them, and you say, Susie, nice to meet you. I'm Julia. And then the air gets weird. And you even notice this in virtual environments. It gets kind of awkward. And Susie might say, oh, Julia, we met at this conference about 2 years ago. And then I'm immediately, before we even start the meeting, I'm put in this spot of, oh no, I said something weird. Now Susie doesn't maybe trust me, or she thinks I don't have a great memory, or maybe she wasn't memorable enough in my mind. And it puts us in a really weird spot. So instead of saying, nice to meet you, I rarely even say that anymore, unless I'm certain I've never met someone. Instead, I say, great to see you. Saying great to see you is going to help you avoid any of those awkward encounters going forward. Another one involves personal information. A lot of our coworkers and people in our lives share details about who they are, what's important to them, all of which is great. And it's important to remember those things. But I never start a conversation with really personal information. So if I see a coworker I might in person that I haven't seen in a few years, and I say, oh, Michelle, it's great to see your husband, or how's your husband, Joe? And again, it's that the air gets weird. And I realized, did I say something wrong? Is her husband's name not really Joe? And she says, well, Joe and I separated during COVID. Immediately, I'm put in this spot where I didn't want to be. And I'm stuck in this situation where the person felt obligated to overshare. And now I don't know how to respond. So I never lead with personal information questions. Instead, I say something like, what's new in your world? That is a question that works with just about anybody, even people that you don't quite know, even at parties or at reunions or things where you're meeting new people, social networking events. What's new in your world? Then it is up to them to volunteer the level of personal information they want to share. And then you can engage with them in that conversation because it's safe, because they presented it to you. So avoiding awkward situations by shaping your language in effective ways, that's going to help you be seen as a more self-actualized and easier person to talk to. Let's see. I believe we have time for one more question. If you're the facilitator of a speech, how do you tell someone to cut to the chase without actually saying it? So if you're the facilitator of a speech, how do you tell someone to cut to the chase? So maybe I'm misinterpreting this question, but it sounds like if you're facilitating something and someone else is speaking and they won't stop talking, or they're just going round and around, how do you effectively get them to maybe get back on track or say what they're actually really get to the source of their comment? There are a few things. There are nonverbal cues that you can begin to do. I mean, you might lean in to show like we need to get moving. Or you might even sit back, some sort of form of movement that says we need to move a little bit faster. We need to progress. That's going to show those things. That's harder to do virtually. At a certain point, you often have to interrupt. And you can do this artfully. You interrupt someone, but say, that's a great point. And then maybe re-emphasize where the conversation needs to go and help them shift there. Something important too is that it's important to make people right before you make them wrong. And this can apply in this situation in a sense that validate what that person is saying, even if it's not where you want to be or where the conversation needs to be right now, but validate it before you begin to shift. And you can articulate this in a thoughtful way on the fly. Validate what they're saying and then begin to shift, help them lead that into what they're trying to really get across to help move the meeting forward. And if you need to just cut them off, I would again just make them right and then shift it to someone else, or maybe you change the conversation. Okay. So again, it was great to see everybody and read some of your comments and be with you here today. Michelle, anything last that we should think about?
Let people know how to connect with you, and you can answer any specific questions in the comments after the event. But thanks so much everyone for coming.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Everybody, I'm on LinkedIn as Julia Prince, and I'm with CRA Admired Leadership. I believe that should be included in some of the information and in the link as well. So feel free to shoot me a message or connect with me there, and happy to chat or answer questions over some time.